Sauron feared very little in Middle-earth. He had already outlasted kingdoms, outlived armies, outmaneuvered wizards who'd studied him for centuries. But there was one man he watched more closely than any other, one bloodline he'd spent 3,000 years trying to make sure never rose again. And it wasn't because that man was strong enough to defeat him in open battle. It was because of what that man represented, standing quietly at the edge of every plan Sauron ever made. Tonight we don't ask whether Aragorn could beat Sauron in a fight. We ask why Sauron, who feared almost nothing, feared him anyway. To understand this fear, you have to go back to the wound that never fully closed. 3,000 years before Aragorn was ever born, a king named Isildur stood over Sauron's fallen body and did the one thing that should have ended everything. He cut the ring from Sauron's hand. That moment should have been Sauron's complete undoing. It wasn't, because Isildur, in the exact instant he had the power to erase Sauron from the world forever, chose to keep the ring instead. That single failure of will didn't just cost Middle-earth an ending. It became the crack in the wall that Sauron would spend the next 3,000 years watching, waiting to see if it would ever widen again. And that's the real reason Aragorn matters so much to him. Aragorn isn't simply a skilled ranger, or a capable leader, or even the rightful heir to a broken throne. He is, in Sauron's eyes, Isildur's second chance, the living proof that the bloodline responsible for his defeat hadn't been extinguished, hadn't scattered into irrelevance, hadn't finally died out the way Sauron had spent 3 millennia hoping it eventually would. Every year Aragorn survived, hidden and unclaimed, was a year that old wound stayed open. Every year he grew stronger without revealing himself, was a year Sauron couldn't be entirely certain the story was finished. This is what makes Sauron's fear so different from ordinary fear, the kind you'd feel facing an enemy army at your gates. Sauron doesn't fear Aragorn's sword. He fears Aragorn's blood. He fears what that bloodline has already proven it's capable of once, and what it might prove capable of again, given the right circumstances and enough time to remember what it once was. For most of Aragorn's life, that fear worked in his favor precisely because it stayed hidden. He spent decades as a ranger, walking under assumed names, protecting a shire that had no idea who was quietly guarding its borders, refusing again and again to claim the throne that was rightfully his. There's something almost unbearably lonely in that choice, if you sit with it fully. Aragorn wasn't simply being humble. He understood, the way his ancestors before him hadn't fully understood, that claiming power before you were ready to hold it responsibly was exactly the kind of failure that had already cost his bloodline everything once before. So instead of rushing toward the crown, he spent his whole life becoming someone worthy of surviving it. That patience is precisely what made him dangerous, in a way Sauron couldn't easily counter. An enemy who wants power quickly can be baited, tricked, tempted into overreaching. An enemy who has already decided to wait as long as necessary, who measures his ambition against decades rather than moments, is far harder to manipulate into a mistake. Sauron understood tyranny intimately. He understood ambition, hunger, the desperate shortcuts people take when they want something badly enough. He had far less experience with someone choosing, again and again, not to take the shortcut, even when it was available to him. And then there is the palantír. When Aragorn finally chose to reveal himself to Sauron directly, seizing the Seeing Stone and letting the Dark Lord look upon his face for the first time in millennia, it wasn't recklessness. It was a deliberate, almost unbearably brave act of psychological warfare. Aragorn understood exactly what that moment would cost Sauron internally. For 3,000 years, Sauron had wondered, in whatever way a being like him wonders, whether the bloodline that once defeated him might someday return to finish what Isildur started. And in a single instant, staring through that dark stone, Sauron finally had his answer. Not a rumor, not a fear he could dismiss as unlikely. Confirmation, delivered directly. that Isildur's heir was alive, was strong, and was no longer hiding. That single moment reshaped the entire war. Sauron, convinced that Aragorn's revelation meant the true heir intended to march on Mordor and claim the ring for himself, made a catastrophic decision born entirely out of fear rather than strategy. He hurled everything he had at the Black Gate far sooner than caution should have allowed, terrified that hesitation would let his oldest enemy's bloodline seize the one thing that could undo him completely. That fear-driven overreaction is exactly what left Mount Doom lightly guarded at the precise moment two small hobbits needed it to be. Aragorn didn't need an army large enough to defeat Sauron outright. He only needed to be frightening enough, in exactly the right way, to make Sauron make a mistake. That's the deepest layer of why this fear matters so much. Sauron had spent 3,000 years building an empire on the assumption that mortal men were fundamentally unreliable, vain, greedy, easily corrupted, ultimately unable to resist the temptation of power once it was placed within reach. That assumption wasn't paranoia. It was, tragically, mostly true, again and again, throughout Middle-earth's history. But Aragorn was the one counterexample Sauron could never fully explain away. A man with every justification to seize power immediately, who instead waited. A man who could have claimed the ring for himself when it was finally within reach, who instead chose, without hesitation, to see it destroyed. Aragorn wasn't just a threat to Sauron's armies. He was a walking refutation of the one belief Sauron had built his entire understanding of mortal nature around. That's a much more dangerous kind of enemy than a powerful one. Sauron could plan around strength. He could counter armies, corrupt kings, exploit ambition wherever he found it. What he couldn't easily plan around was integrity that didn't break under pressure, patience that didn't curdle into greed, a bloodline that had failed once and, against every historical pattern Sauron had come to rely on, finally learned from that failure instead of repeating it. In the end, Aragorn never needed to personally strike Sauron down to defeat him. He simply needed to be exactly the kind of man Sauron didn't believe could exist anymore. Patient, where his ancestor had been weak. Humble, where a crown might have made him arrogant. Willing to let a moment of temptation pass by, rather than seize it. That, more than any sword or army, is what finally settled the debt Isildur left unpaid 3,000 years earlier. Maybe that's the real answer to why Sauron feared him. Not because Aragorn was destined for greatness in some abstract prophetic sense, but because he was living proof that the same bloodline capable of failing catastrophically once was also capable, given enough time and enough humility, of becoming something entirely different the second time history offered it the chance. Sauron built his entire war around the belief that men always break eventually. Aragorn spent his whole life quietly proving that some of them don't. If this story moved you, there are more waiting, quiet corners of Middle-earth that history remembers, but rarely feels. Subscribe and walk them with us.